I send greetings to all our colleagues gathered in Ragusa, and I hope the meeting will be a success. I'm not an expert on today's topic, but I've written a good amount about it in my forthcoming book, and today I'm offering an overview of scholarship with a bibliography, in English, I'm afraid, of recent work. I hope this will be of use. 19th century European commentary on China established a notion that China had, in Hegel's words, turned away from the sea. This was never remotely true, but it is true that the involvement with the sea of states based in China has been quite different from that of the early modern European states. Early China was inland, centered on the basin of the Yellow River, and the only contact with the sea was the Gulf of Bohai. The enlargement of the Chinese political realm to encompass the current coast of China all took place in the past 1800 years, and at each stage, the necessity to fortify the coast and to generate systems of revenue collection was salient, while the livelihoods of ocean-going fishermen and tradesmen was always a significant part of the economy. The development of armored ships and seagoing weapons was important in the Song period, 1,000 years ago, when wars stimulated the development of a major state naval capacity. The security of the coasts was a high priority, but islands, whether they were Hainan or Macau or Taiwan, tended to be regarded as outside the security perimeter. Primarily, Chinese shipbuilding and seagoing commerce was a private enterprise in China, with the vivid exception of the Zhenghe voyages during the Ming Dynasty. These imperially commissioned expeditions involved enormous ships that were not otherwise technically advanced over their Song predecessors. Their mission was to announce to the major trading societies of the Indian Ocean that, after a short period during which the Ming Emperor had banned most foreign trade, the empire was back in business. These voyages achieved their mission and vigorously promoted the reputation of the Yongle Emperor who had sponsored them, but they were never repeated. I would like to comment on the scope of legal sea trade in the Song, Yuan, Ming, and early Qing periods. Chinese ships, which we know as junk from a Javanese term, these ships were renowned for buoyancy and stability, and during the Zhenghe expeditions, they certainly demonstrated their capacity for very long-distance transport. Nevertheless, Chinese commercial traffic, as it developed from about 800 to 1800, was generally limited to the South China Sea and the islands of Southeast Asia and Taiwan and the East China Sea. China's direct trade with the economies of these regions was built upon the export of sugar, paper, select silk and porcelain, and land animal skin products, and the import of rice, timber, and sea animals. The products best known to Europeans and the economies of the Indian Ocean were, in contrast, porcelain, furniture, some forms of silk, and, in the early modern period, tea. Chinese products intended for these markets were normally offloaded in the Strait of Malacca. There they were transferred to the ships of South Asia, Persian Gulf, or East African merchants. From the 10th century at the latest, the Strait of Malacca, today roughly the site of Singapore, was pivotal to global trade for largely this reason, and in the late 16th century became a focus of European mercantile and colonial activity. From the earliest contact of Chinese states with the sea, piracy had been inseparable from legal sea commerce. Fishermen were vulnerable to theft by other fishermen who might be organized and based on the offshore islands. Because of the systemic surveillance of the coasts in the Song period, raiders tended to not be based on the China coast. After the Song period, the Yuan, the Ming, and the Qing regimes did not sustain unified imperial navies, but instead they assigned coastal security to local provincial garrisons. Trading ships were always vulnerable to raids by competitors and also more organized thieves from more distant locations, often along the trade routes themselves. State interception of piracy was never particularly effective. In some periods, the governments of both societies required people living on the coast, including fishermen, to move inland to prevent pirates from gaining the food, the weapons, the timber, and the slaves they frequently took from coastal settlements. This was economically ruinous and tended to feed land-based smuggling and theft. As a consequence, coastal settlements were quickly reoccupied, and pirate networks continued to enjoy the resources they systematically gathered from land dwellers. The degree of organization of pirate activity is still not well understood, partly because normal historical narrative structures of states, laws, cultures, and languages do not fit well the topography of ocean-based piracy in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. As early as the 14th century, we have ample evidence of a very large and loosely connected world of raiding, trading, warehousing, and corruption of officials that stretched from southern Japan to islands of southern Indonesia, encompassing the Philippines, the Malacca Strait, the coasts of Vietnam and China. Throughout China and Southeast Asia, farmers in winter or in times of hardship joined in smuggling or sea piracy operations, returning to their legal activities when the time was right. The populations of this world, the best known of them was the Chinese-Japanese Zheng family of Taiwan, which eventually founded the Kingdom of Dongning. These populations were based on multi-generational exchange, mixing all peoples and languages of these regions. From the 16th century on, the local languages were joined by Portuguese and, to a lesser degree, Spanish. After the very late 16th century, these peoples also showed adherence to religions that had been banned in China, particularly Roman Catholicism. Yet, in the constant mixing of diverse elements, there appears to have been a certain unity, some evidence of a pidgin universal, probably based on Tagalog, with a lexicon borrowed from Chinese and Portuguese, and clear evidence of communications relating to traffic, prices, demand, opportunities, and a certain amount of coordinated defense against attempted state intervention. Pirate populations were always small in comparison to land. A late 18th century estimate by the Qing government put Chinese involvement well under 100,000 and suggests a total regional participation of under 1 million. But their impact on trade and pricing, state priorities, was disproportionate. In Taiwan in particular, pirate alliances defeated colonizing attempts by Spain and by the Netherlands, and repelled attempted French incursions in the later 19th century. In some instances, the pirates were a state resource, as when the Qing state recruited pirates to aid in the suppression of the last Ming resistance fighters or fight the British in the Opium War. Both legal and illegal sea patterns were seriously disrupted in East Asia by the arrival of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and later the EIC, the English East India Company, and this happened in the very first years of the 17th century. The Europeans arrived with massively armed, high-riding ships designed to not only travel on their sea lanes across the Indian Ocean and through the South China Sea, but to secure them. Networked pirates occasionally seized these armed ships and deployed them in their own activities, but the firepower of the pirates never compared with that of the European merchant companies. This eventually caused the Qing court in China to rely upon the English East India Company, which after 1707 is the British East India Company, for pirate suppression. Beyond the redrawing of commercial rights as an effect of European sea power, the priorities for trading products were also changed by the arrival of the European companies. Tea from China is an example of a product that was not supremely influential in the Chinese sea trade before 1600, but afterward grew steeply on European demand. Porcelain had been an important Chinese export since the 10th century, but in the 16th century became the object of very steep European demand. This lessened after the early 18th century as Europeans developed their own porcelain, and that's a contrast to the steady rise of tea through the 18th and early 19th centuries. But European fortunes based on sales of opium and cotton to China, and based on banking and on insurance, steadily increased the role of maritime activity in the economic rise of Europe. For the Qing Empire, the Chinese economy, as the largest and most industrially productive in the world in the 18th century, had no rational need of elaborate finance and security of overseas trade, since part of the steady income of the Chinese elites and government was keeping the overhead expenses of international trade very low. The Opium War did not change Qing practices for security of the coast or suppression of piracy. This was partly because there were many internal crises that limited the Qing ability to address international issues. But more important, Qing officials did not see the European sea powers as an existential threat, and they were correct about that. On the other hand, the rapid growth of Meiji Japan as a sea power after 1868 did present Qing with an existential threat, and in that case the response was not slow. Through the 1870s and 1880s, Qing focus on naval modernization was consistent enough that their investments in German shipping both propelled the rise of the Qing Empire as a naval power and speeded the development of the German shipbuilding industry. By 1885, the Qing Navy owned 2 destroyers that were believed to be the largest and the best gunned in the world. Qing changed its strategies for coastal security, including considering islands of critical importance for the first time. This caused Qing to attempt to alter the status and use of a number of islands in the South China Sea, and most important, to make Taiwan a province of the Qing Empire in 1885. Despite global expectations, Qing proceeded to lose major naval conflicts against France in 1885 and against Japan in 1894. The international consequences of the second of these were significant, but the domestic consequences, including reaction to the novel Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, were much greater and led directly to the end of the empire in 1912. This was, in large part, because the importance of maritime security had been fiercely embraced by the Chinese public.